Seated.
You may be seated, everyone. Yes, thank you, Shayna, and Rabbi Rich, and everyone. Isn't it neat to see 14 or 15 of you up here involved in the Torah service today? It's just beautiful. I love it. So that's the way it's supposed to be. We're all participate together. Well, today we read Parshat Tetzaveh, and after hearing the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai, which was Parshat Yitro, a few back, and receiving case law all about the Ten Commandments and how we live them out, Parshat Mishpatim, Moshe ascends to the mountain for 40 days. And last week in Parshat Terumah, God instructed Moshe to build a Mishkan, a holy dwelling for God on earth. And this Mikdash, also called the Mishkan, the tabernacle, later became the Great Jerusalem Temple. Tetzaveh continues with detailed instructions for the Mishkan, the sacred garments for the high priest. Last week, if you were here last week, we asked the question why the Mishkan was so important that it merited 7 detailed chapters of instructions for its building. An early rabbinic tradition teaches that Moshe didn't ascend into a cloud at Sinai. Instead, heaven bent down and touched the mountain. God showed him the heavenly Mishkan and said, "Build what you see in heaven here on earth, and then I will come and dwell with you." And though the temple remains destroyed and the Dome of the Rock stands on the Temple Mount, our sages teach that the commandment to build the Mishkan still applies today. Now, we must build it within ourselves, a replica of heaven, a dwelling for God's presence within our hearts. Even in the diaspora, our sages teach that we must build this Mishkan inside of ourselves. There are several midrashim that compare parts of the temple to organs of the human body, and each midrashim sort of has different ways of constructing it and different symbolism around this. But the connections are very real. Last week we explored one connection that likens the Mishkan to a human face, if you remember. Rav Shaul, Paul, writes in 1 Corinthians 3:16, "Don't you know that you are God's temple and that the Ruach Elohim dwells inside of you?" And I wonder if rabbinic tradition was inspired by Rav Shaul, by Paul. The message is clear. Our bodies are meant to be holy dwelling places for God's presence, reflecting the kingdom of heaven in the world. So what I want to do today is walk through the temple courts and explore how to build a holy dwelling within our hearts. I do have a slide, 2 slides for us today, just to be able to see some things. So here are just some images I was able to find of the different temples. At the top is Herod's temple, the second temple in the 1st century. Of course, this is just a replica, a small replica that was, and so it's much more dramatic, I would imagine, in person. And then at the bottom left is a drawing of the wilderness Mishkan. And then at the right is like a glimpse into the inside of the wilderness Mishkan. And then in the middle there is that's actually from the Temple Institute, so that is like a recreation of the 2 cherubim on top of the ark, which I believe if there were to be a temple, the idea is that would be used. So more than a recreation, it's trying to build it. Okay, so what we want to do is start from the outside and work our ways in. So let's start from the outer walls. Now, in the wilderness Mishkan, it's really just the 2 places. But as you see in the second temple, it was expanded. So we have these huge outer courts that are around the Mishkan itself with these huge walls. And the western wall, where we go to pray at the Temple Mount, is believed to be part of the outer retaining wall of the second temple. And that's why, we go there and pray, because it's as close as we can get. The outer walls of the Mishkan in the wilderness was fine linen cloth supported by wooden beams marking the boundary of this sacred space. So think of your entire body and your mind as a temple. The outer walls of your temple could represent your physical body, your flesh, which gives your soul concrete existence in the world. In the Torah, our physical bodies are holy. They're set apart for God's purposes. Again, in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul writes, "Don't you know that your body is a temple of the Ruach HaKodesh, who is in you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God with your body." In Torah and in Jewish thought, our bodies are good. Our bodies are valuable. They're holy. They're set apart for God's purposes. And Jewish life is about having inviting God's holiness into daily lives. It's about setting us apart for Him. So our blessings, all of our blessings begin, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has kiddishanu b'mitzvotav," who sanctifies us with His commandments. And kiddishanu doesn't imply salvation by commandments, or it's just not that discussion at all. It's rather that God adds holiness or sets us apart for Himself through these commandments, through His instructions, through His life. The mitzvot are actions that we do that set us apart in the world, showing that we belong to God, showing to ourselves and to the rest of the world. For example, Friday night we gather with our families for Shabbat prayers, bringing holiness into the home. While the rest of the world keeps going, we pause. Just as God ceased from creating to celebrating Shabbat, we stop working and producing and buying and fixing, and instead we step into God's Shabbat because we belong to Him. The prayers we sing on Friday night connect to the temple, making the Shabbat table today a Mishkan in and of itself. The Shabbat table is considered our altar. Keeping kosher is about bringing holiness into your lives. When Adam and Eve ate what was forbidden, God's presence lifted, and they made themselves their own gods. The dietary laws in the Torah give us a daily opportunity to reverse this, declaring, "God, you are in charge of what I put in my body, because you are in charge of everything in my life, even what I eat." And it creates this whole structure where we can reverse Adam and Chava, and as a people. That's what the kosher laws are really about. We wear tzitzit as a constant reminder to keep our hearts and our bodies and our minds focused on God. The laws of nidah and marital purity. Think of fasting on Yom Kippur. The prayers before we eat, the prayers after we eat. These all reinforce that we are a holy people with holy bodies. Everything we do is holy. We need a blessing for everything. There is even a prayer that we say after using the bathroom, because using the bathroom is holy. Torah tells us not to cut or to mark our bodies, because we're to be set apart for the Lord, holy for the Lord. And the truth is, our bodies are not our own to do with as we please. It's contrary to our society today. Strengthening the outer walls of our temple begins with recognizing that our bodies and our minds and our emotions are created for a holy purpose. And this is how we begin to build a Mishkan within our hearts. Okay, let's move on to outer courts. The outer courts were a place for gathering. In temple times, they became a bustling marketplace filled with vendors and selling food and souvenirs and meeting places. We know that the early Messianic Jewish community at 5 to 10,000 in the book of Acts, they would meet in the outer courts, and that's where they would gather. That's probably where Acts 2 happened. Now, this is likely where Yeshua overturned the tables, declaring, "It is written, my house should be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." Instead of being set apart for God's purposes, the outer courts were used for personal gain, extorting and cheating the vulnerable. As we build our own inner mini Mishkan, our outer courts can be either used to honor God and those that He's placed into our lives, or they could become corrupt, where we see others as means to serve our own interests. The Torah calls us to bring holiness into our relationships. Leviticus 19, "Do not take revenge or bear a grudge, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Isaiah 1, "Learn to do good, to seek justice. Relieve the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." Micah 6, "What does Adonai require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God." John 13, love one another as I have loved you. By this all will know that you are my disciples. Ephesians 4, walk in a manner worthy of your calling, with humility, with gentleness, patience, bearing with one another in love and keeping unity in the Spirit. In our Havruta project that we're doing now, we're studying Musar, instruction in this kind of character. We work with a partner to work on traits like humility and compassion and generosity, to grow in holiness, love, service. This is essential work in our lives and in our community, lest we turn our outer courts into a den of thieves. As we move into our inner courts, and here we have just a drawing of the Mishkan itself with the women's court, which is still sort of an outer court, and then we move through up 15 stairs up into the priestly area, and here we have our altar. So let's talk about the altar. The great altar where sacrifices were made. In Hebrew, they're called korbanot, which means to draw near. The sin offerings require taking ownership for our actions before God. The burnt offerings demonstrate that our entire lives are devoted to God. And the thanksgiving offerings put God on the throne of our hearts. Romans 12 calls us to make your lives a living sacrifice. Not just part of our lives, but all of our lives. Our inner courts are where we encounter God, offering our hearts as living sacrifices. Just as the altar was for purification and dedication, we are called to purify our hearts and to align our lives with His will. Now, just as sacrifices were a form of worship, our inner Mishkan is a place for worship. The priests had to be ritually pure. They inspected every sacrifice that came in for blemishes. And likewise, we must guard and inspect what enters into our inner courts, lest we allow impure and blemished things inside of our Mishkan. Now remember, this is framed with the love and musar and relationships that we have beforehand. So we have to put all of these things together. But think about this. What will you allow to influence you? What will you allow to influence you? I've seen this again and again. We really do become like the people we are with. So as we sift through everything coming our way, we might ask ourselves, are you surrounded by holy friends who encourage you and who love you? Isolation can be very dangerous. We need each other. What do you read? What do you listen to? What do you watch? How do you relax? These are daily choices that shape our Mishkan. And, I don't usually kind of get into this kind of thing or talk about it too much from the podium, but I just want to highlight a serious blemish that is we have to become aware of because it's so much a part of our community. When Corinthians speaks of our bodies as a temple, it warns specifically, the whole context is around destroying our temple, that we might destroy it by allowing sexual immorality inside. And this takes many forms. Again, not something we normally talk about, but pornography is deeply embedded into our society. In 2024, the new studies, it's amazing, showed that 78% of men, 43% of women, and 73% of teens in the U.S. regularly consume it. The industry now, worldwide, is generating up to $287 billion. The industry is inseparable from sex trafficking, from abuse, and modern slavery. You can't separate them. That's a whole other message, but you can't separate them. It is a deep injustice in the world. It's oppression. It's a violation of human dignity, and yet it's just a Google search away on an unprotected device. It destroys marriages. It destroys intimacy, emotional and spiritual sensitivity. It numbs our souls. And we're called to be holy temples, created for real love and true joy and true life found only in God's presence. Now, I'm not raising this to condemn anyone, but to educate. I don't share it for purposes of like, hey, you're bad. It's like to educate and say, hey, pornography rewires the brain. It's as addictive as heroin. And many good people are trapped and need help. So I'll stop there, but if anyone needs help in this area, reach out. Please reach out. Freedom is possible, but the first step is to ask for help. That's the first step. And then we have compassion, and we work on it together. And one more point just to parents out there or future parents. The average age of addiction as of 2024 starts at 12, often younger. So that's the average age. Sometimes it's as early as 8. So I just urge you to use safe devices. That's easy these days. And start conversations early. 6 to 8 years old is when you start talking about this with kids. And talk to me. I have books and resources of how to talk with kids about these sorts of things in age-appropriate ways. So, okay, let's move on. Pornography is a serious issue, but we also need to guard everything that enters our inner soul. Raina and I have decided that we're just too young to watch R-rated movies. Ephesians 5 calls us to be imitators of God, knowing that we are dearly loved children, walking in love as Messiah loved, offering himself as a fragrant sacrifice to God. Paul warns against even a hint of immorality, and he includes greed in there, right next to it. He even includes unholy speech right next to sexual immorality. These are the same. Forms of idolatry that risk our inheritance in the kingdom of heaven, he says. Think about how to boil a frog. You know the analogy. You drop a live frog into a boiling pot, it jumps out. But if you put the frog in cold water and heat it up slowly, then it just boils until he's cooked. So when we flood our minds with unhealthy content around the world and call it downtime, are we slowly desensitizing ourselves? You're not a frog. God called you to be a Mishkan. So we need to ask, does this entertainment or media or habit, does it belong in my temple? Will it draw you closer to God, or will it push you away? Is there something you can identify right now that maybe needs to be removed from your temple? Holiness isn't about living in fear. It's not about being self-protective, and it's not just about rules. It's about creating and catching a vision for life that's set apart, even when it feels extreme to our culture. And it's not about only removing the unhealthy things. It's even more about filling our Mishkan with God's life. So Ephesians 5 continues and urges us to wake up. He says, live wisely, make the most of our time, filling our hearts with the scripture, with the Ruach, with worshiping with joy. He says, wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Messiah will shine on you. Make the most of your time because days are evil. Be filled with the Ruach, speaking to one another in psalms and in hymns and in spiritual songs, singing and making music in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father and everything in the name of the Lord Yeshua the Messiah. That's beautiful. So let us edify one another, build one another up in the Lord, and dedicate our altar to him. Let's continue on in our temple. As we move past the altar and we move up the stairs, we're ready to enter the Olam. It's the foyer to the holy place. This is a beautiful, joy-filled room that in the Second Temple times was lined with gold chains hanging from the ceiling, hanging vessels, and stunning decorations. The young priests, we hear, would climb these chains to peek over at the work being done in the deeper courts within the temple. Our prayer service, the time of singing psalms and praise and thanksgiving called Pezuke de Zimra, is crafted after this room. Each psalm is like a gold link in the chains hanging in the Olam. When we give ourselves fully to God, he creates a beautiful, sacred place of praise and joy, an Olam inside of our hearts. Here is where we realize the value of praise and thanksgiving to God. Giving praise and expressing gratitude is a secret to joy. It can dissolve depression. It can heal a wounded heart. It can bring life if you can step out and praise, really praise. As Psalm 100 says, shout for joy to Adonai, all the earth. Worship Adonai with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs and enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise, and give thanks to him and bless his name. We move forward into the holy place. In Jerusalem, the walls were 9 feet thick, and here we find the incense altar, the menorah, the showbread table, and beyond the huge parochet curtain lies the Holy of Holies. So now we're deep inside our inner Mishkan. The golden menorah weighed 80 pounds and stood 5 feet tall. It was relit every night, symbolizing God's eternal presence so that it would burn all the time continuously. In the Midrashim, comparing the temple to our body, the menorah represents our eyes. our ability to perceive God's revelation and wisdom, to hear his voice and to feel his presence. So what happens if we neglect to relight our menorah every day? We lose our spiritual sight, our ability to sense God guiding and speaking to us from within, and he will feel distant and less relevant in our lives. That's why we study the Bible. That's why we pray. That's why we spend time listening to God every morning. And first thing I suggest. And that's why we gather for Shabbat and holy days and do the things we do, prioritizing being together with one another in community to relight our inner menorah. So look inside. How bright is your menorah burning? Next to the menorah is the showbread offering, bread that was left out on display, showbread, made visible by the light of the menorah until it was eaten by the priests and then replaced. So the Midrash compares the bread with the stomach. Bread is the sustenance of life. We might think of Deuteronomy 3:8, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of Adonai. The light of the menorah reveals that we are really made of inside, who we are, what's our substance. In the deepest places of our heart, who or what do we look for true sustenance? Who do we look for to solve life's problems first? Where do we go? John 6:35, Yeshua said, I am the bread of life. The one who comes to me will never be hungry, and the one who believes in me will never be thirsty. In the center, we have the Ketoret, where incense is burned, continuously filling the temple with a fragrant aroma. This incense can be compared to the deeper meditations of our hearts, our secret desires and unspoken thoughts known only to us and God. As Psalm 19:14 says, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, Adonai, my rock and my redeemer. Our incense must be consumed with prayer. Revelation 5:8, just before what we read today, golden bowls of incense represent the prayers of the righteous. Here, prayer is like the soundtrack to our life, as a constant inner conversation with God, filling our holy place with the fragrance of prayer. Philippians 4, do not be anxious about everything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Thessalonians, rejoice always, pray without ceasing. In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Messiah Yeshua for you. Ephesians, with every prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit, and to this end be alert with all perseverance and petition for all of the righteous. Colossians, devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving. What kind of incense are you burning in your holy place? Now, the paroket was stunning, woven with blue, symbolizing the holiness of God, purple representing royalty, scarlet for atonement, white linen for righteousness, with two cherubim woven as guardians. In Second Temple times, it was 4 inches thick and 80 feet tall. And we can compare the paroket perhaps to our self-image. I make it a point to have one-on-one dates with my kids. And parents, I recommend you do this, or future parents, do this all the time. One-on-one dates with the kids is the best. And one date that I remember was when Aviva was 3. Sorry, Aviva, but she did give me permission. So 10 years ago, we kayaked on the Charles River and got within 5 feet of a blue jay with its wings fanned, full of colors. And I took the chance to share Yeshua's words, look, if God clothes the birds with splendor, how much more will he care for you? And then we took it a step further, and we said, if God made that bird so beautiful, and you're much more valuable to him, then how much more beautiful are you than that bird? And she grasped it in her 3-year-old way, but we all need to understand this today. Because the lies and the hurt and the brokenness of our world, some people will feel ugly or unlovable or full of shame. We may feel like failures or unworthy of real love, unable to reflect God's beauty. Instead of feeling more valuable than the blue jay, we might feel worthless, feel like we have nothing to offer. I think the root of the problem, there's all kinds of things, but the root of the problem is that we just don't know who we really are. We don't know whose we really are. And these hurts and wounds have found their place on our paroket. Healing comes when we tend to all of these areas of our Mishkan we've been talking about, and we remember who our Heavenly Abba truly is, when we allow him to speak to us in our inner courts, revealing who we are and how he sees us, woven together in our mother's womb, made in God's image, like the blue, royal to his people, like the purple, sins atoned for, like the scarlet, and like the linen, clothed in the righteousness of Yeshua. Cheruvim guard our coming and going. Perhaps these are guardian angels in our life. You're even more beautiful than the blue jay on a fall day. So the next time that you look in the mirror, remember that your body is a temple, a reflection of God's image, created to share his glory with all of creation. Now at last we step through the paroket into the holy place, the Kadosh Kedoshim, the Holy of Holies. Inside, gold lines the walls and the floor. At the center stands the Ark of the Covenant, guarded by 2 golden cheruvim. And within it, a golden box holds 2 tablets with the 10 commandments, God's words. Beside it, a jar of manna. Beside that, Aaron's budding rod, reminders of God's faithfulness to Israel. Here we encounter the presence of God. Now, the Midrash compares the Kadosh Kedoshim to the deepest parts of our heart, our innermost sanctuary of devotion and love. Is your inner Kadosh Kedoshim lined with gold? A secret sanctuary after God's own heart? A space set apart and prepared for him? Yeshua tells us, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Is Torah at the very center of your heart, inside your ark? Are these words inscribed in your heart? Do you cherish the scriptures and his commandments and his life and his ways? And like the manna and Aaron's rod are reminders of God's work in Israel's life, is your heart a place where you cherish God's greatest works in your life above all of the other things you've done? Is your heart a secret place where you encounter Yeshua? That's what building a Mishkan is, your heart is all about. Let Yeshua make you a sacred place. Let him make your heart sacred, paved with gold, his words at the center and filled with his presence. So to close, allow me to summarize our walk through the temple. Your outer walls, your body, life, and soul have a holy mission. Stay set apart for God. Let the Torah, commandments, and Messianic Jewish life shape your inner Mishkan. Your outer courts cultivate godly character and sacred friendships. Carry each other's burdens and uplift and encourage one another. Your altar, remove idols. Dedicate your life to fully live after God and Yeshua and his ways for you. Put him first above all other things. Your olam, fill your heart and your mind and your words with praise and thanksgiving. Your menorah, light your menorah every day and invite the presence of the Lord inside. Your showbread, rely on Yeshua, the bread of life, as your true sustenance. Your incense offering, let prayer be the fragrance of your life, permeating everything. Your paroket, see yourself through God's eyes. And then enter your Holy of Holies. Let God make your heart his dwelling, his Mishkan. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.